If we want to understand the Middle East, if we want to understand why conflicts are happening the way they are and how these conflicts may be resolved, we cannot take our eyes off of the Shia-Sunni conflict. Whether it's the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or the Syria war, or the escalating civil war in Iraq, they all involve sectarianism between Shias and Sunnis.
The Shia-Sunni divide is a political and religious divide around who was the rightful heir after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad in early Islam. Yes, it's remote history going back to the 7th century, but for millions of Muslims around the world, it's what defines them, sectarianism.
بأن الجريمة التي ارتكبت بحق الحسين لم تنتهي وإنما لا زالت فصولها التي نعيشها اليوم من الإرهابيين والطائفيين والحاقدين على الإسلام وأهل البيت.
Now, it is not as if you could say, well, let's just resolve this original dispute over the succession and we can be one. There is now 1400 years of different political, social, cultural, and theological history that separates them.
Of the approximately 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, about 85% are Sunni and 15% are Shia. This is a conflict of identity far more than it is a conflict of belief and practice. People actually do feel this divide deeply, emotionally. We are seeing a catastrophic civil war in Syria between the Sunni and the Shia, an ongoing conflict in Lebanon between the majority Shia population and the Sunni leadership, and in Iraq over the last decade, a devastating battle between the Sunni minority and the Shia majority. We've seen it in Iran with a small Sunni population in the south, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, in which puritanical movements within Sunni Islam have slaughtered thousands of Shia. In Bahrain, the very large oppressed Shia majority has risen up against the Sunni leadership of that country.
This conflict stares America in the face. It does have an effect on US foreign policy and US interests in the region. Whether it's in Syria, where we've seen tens of thousands of people being killed and millions displaced, or Pakistan, where the US is concerned about what happens when it withdraws from Afghanistan, or Bahrain, where the US Fifth Fleet is based, Saudi Arabia, which is home to oil reserves, whether it's in Iraq, where the US has lost lives and billions of dollars in treasure.
There are dangers of fierce sectarian fighting if, for example, the terrorist organizations try to overrun sacred Shia sites, which could trigger Shia-Sunni conflicts that could be very hard to stamp out. So we have enormous interest there.
My greatest fear is that something could conflate that leads to an all-out sectarian regional war. God forbid that it should happen, but the ingredients for that happening are very much alive.
For most of Islamic history, Shiites and Sunnis have lived quietly side by side, not necessarily happily, but quietly. Pogroms and outright conflict have been rare in history, and they happen when there is a political prize to fight over. The most important primary event that brought the Shia-Sunni conflict into the fore was the Iranian Revolution. Once the Shiites asserted their preeminence in carrying out an Islamic revolution in Islamic politics, there was immediately Sunni backlash.
Fast forward to 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell, for the first time in that capital, you have a Shiite-dominated government, which didn't go unnoticed in the Gulf, and certainly not in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh. And as chaos spread through Iraq, you could only depend on your own community and your affiliation with that community to keep you alive. And that's when you really saw the Sunni-Shia divide become personal. It was no longer political, but it was neighborhood to neighborhood and neighbor to neighbor.
The Arab uprisings have also been a factor that's reignited the conflict. This is why you see a civil war in Syria that has a strong sectarian dimension. In many countries, what started as a political rivalry evolved into also a religious conflict.
It's not that the Shias and Sunnis were not there in history before. It was that sectarianism was contained by the structure of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. The structure that was containing them cracked. So that actually caused the fight that was simmering below this edifice of calm in the region to erupt.
أدعو المسلمين أن يذهبوا لينصروا إخوتهم في سوريا. لا يمكن أن ندع إخوتنا يقتلون ونحن نتفرج، حرام علينا.
وإذا احتاجت المعركة مع هؤلاء الإرهابيين التكفيريين أن أذهب أنا وكل حزب الله إلى سوريا، سنذهب إلى سوريا.
Whether it's Shia or Sunni, the motivation is all the same. What they all have in common is the embrace of theological justifications to legitimize the violence that they perpetrate, that transforms the motivations to commit this violence to something much more personal. For all these groups to survive and for all of them to engage in terrorism, they need some outside patron, whether it's wealthy individuals or whether it's a state backer.
Both Iran and Saudi Arabia have been responsible for escalating this Sunni-Shia divide. And they are doing it for their own geopolitical interests. It's not just a perception that these two countries are trying to control different parts of the Middle East. It's a reality. It's in the form of funding, it's in the form of arms, it's in the form, in some cases, of even soldiers inside these countries.
There are no bright spots in the region. Sectarianism will mean instability in the region for some period. That'd be difficult for states to rule over their populations happily. You're going to end up with challenges to authority, civil wars, violence, bombings, etc. That would keep the region from focusing on economic growth, focusing on political stability. What we can do is to encourage the major regional powers to deal with their differences. And we have to help Middle East states cross this transition from authoritarianism to veritable democracy.
You can't say to a minority, whether it be a Sunni or a Shiite, democracy will be great for you because what people hear is majority rules. That's not democracy. And until there's a system that protects different sectarian expressions of religion, there's not an answer in the region to the Sunni-Shia divide.